Hi everyone, I'm James Stone. If you haven't met me, I'm a senior software developer here at Futurice, and today I have a presentation called Workshop Storefront, which is kind of stolen from Brad Frost. He has an article of a similar name, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And my goal today with the talk is to kind of introduce you a little bit to my background, philosophy, and the goal is maybe one of these technologies, maybe you might try it in one of your current projects or your next project if you're interested. So I have to warn you, I'm a little bit dangerous because I have 2 degrees in art, and I wanted to start with these ideas of computational arts and form. And there's a guy named Casey Reas who wrote a book called Code and Form, and he talks, I think, about 5 or 6 different types of ways you might express form within computational arts, which I think applies to web and web design. And so I have 2 slides, which I think are 2 ideas that are going to be echoed by the use of some of this tooling and the idea of design systems. So does anyone have any guess which idea this might be? Anyone from the audience? Like what would computers be good at in terms of art compared to a person? Like maybe a person is good with tone or line quality. What do you think this might be? Well, repetition, yes, correct. And this is super repetitive, and I think we all probably know it's very easy, right, with a function or an object to repeat things thousands or tens of thousands of times, right? You can just run it through a loop or run it through succession. It's no challenge for a computer to do this. And so I have one more. What about this? It's maybe a little bit more challenging. It's something else that computers really excel at, and maybe functions really excel at as well. So not repetition, but something similar. I'll probably slaughter the word, but it's parameterization, right? You have parameters that could be articulated. And so in this example, other than just plain repetition, we could be articulating the parameter, right, of these succulents. We get different shapes and forms. And so this is something else in the field of arts, computational arts, that kind of excel. This is what computers excel at. So as I go through the talk, maybe think about these 2 ideas, like repetition and parameterization, and how they apply. And the other thing I'm really excited about, and this is a talk about React, is this like container component architecture. Has everyone heard of this? There's different names for it. The idea is you have like a stateless functional component, something that's a pure function, and this is rendering out to the screen, right, the UI. And then you have something else that is sitting on top of that. Some people call that a container or a wrapper, and that's where all the logic, right, or the side effects are living. And I think, you know, with Docker and other things like this idea, this visual metaphor is a little bit flawed or it's hard to understand. But I think of the wrapper, the container, actually as being this idea of the crane, right? So in the container itself, we can kind of input new elements and change what's inside of it. But the crane is kind of operated by a human. It moves things around. It interacts with different containers. I think this is kind of expanding on that kind of philosophy. All right, so my story is recently, I started a new project a few months ago, and I started this onboarding process. And maybe when you're new to a project, you think it's going to go totally smooth. It's like this linear path. You're like, okay, I'm going to start this first feature, and it's usually something really small. It goes really smooth. And I think when you first think of a problem, it's easy to think of it as like this, like point A to point B. I just connect the dots and do these things. But if you've worked on a project for any time, right, we have these like different branches of different features, and it's a bit more complex. And I thought of this cross-country skiing, which I haven't done myself, only in my mind. I hope to soon. But you have these tracks that you're following, right, going in a straight line. But I thought projects are really a bit more like this, right? We have this fractured time. We have all these things happening simultaneously in different types of steps. And what I'm really interested in this case, is we have a project that's very complex, and we need to add something that's UI focused, but we can't actually add it until we build all this logic, right? We have to get really far down the application to be able to make changes, to be able to introduce what those UI changes are. And since I've been working mostly with UI and kind of design systems the past few years, this is what I'm really interested in, and how can we kind of skip ahead in React, say, to 5 or 6, or it could be a bit arbitrary, but how can we skip ahead to kind of get right to the UI stuff? And I also like this idea of failing fast or shipping something fast. I think Steve Jobs said, real artists ship, right? So if you don't actually ship something, you've got nothing to show, right? Like that's what separates the great artists that you know about from the ones that were never heard about, perhaps. And they give this analogy, right? Like if you're going to create transportation or a car, right? You do the skateboard first because it's simple. And I thought we're in Finland. We don't even need wheels right now. We've got snow. What's simpler than that? You just need something underneath you, and you can try out this transportation idea. So I like this idea, but the problem is, you know, with the complexity, like how do we get to that fun stuff, right? How do we get to the point where we can test it and see what users say, see how people are interacting with it, and kind of skip some of those other steps. And the other thing I learned when I was onboarding is when you're in the newer project, and I think this one's about 12,000 lines of code, like it's almost like you've got a microscope. So you're trying to solve a problem. You can't really start from this big level of like what the UI is and how the component interacts. It's more like you're in a microscope, right? And you're starting like number 5, you might be like way over here, or if you're modifying something, you're way into the details of the components, and it's maybe many different levels in. And it's hard to keep like a big holistic picture of how the app is working. And so again, like my goal is like, how do we kind of dig deep? How do we get to the components, dealing with like the complexity of the app? So in this Brad Frost article, he talks about like the current state of UI, design and development. And he talks about tooling and how there's this idea of the factory and the storefront. And he says there's a spectrum, and I'm kind of stealing this or borrowing it from another article by Chroma and kind of expanding upon it. But the idea is that there's this gradient across, right, from Storybook, which is a tool that you can use for component UI building. It's kind of called like a component builder. And Syleguidist, which is more of like a living style guide, kind of intended for documenting systems rather than actually building them. And the other thing that I found is I think CSS and React kind of sucks, the built-in. And I found that styled components is kind of what I'm leaning towards, and I really like that technology. So I'm going to talk about these 3 kind of in order. All right, so maybe to expand a little bit on this idea, you've got like the factory, like the car factory. This is like where we're doing all the work, right? But it's not like a great place to bring the stakeholders in, like maybe not even the UI designers. It depends on how much someone can understand what this is, right? You have to ask yourself, like, does the CEO of the company, do they understand what these parts of the car, like the weld, do they understand that, and can they visualize the end product? And if not, like the factory is not really a great tool to demonstrate those things. And when I think of CSS and styled components, I think of this kind of like a paint booth. It's still part of the factory, right? You probably wouldn't want the CEO in there unless they knew a lot about cars. So it still doesn't look very polished. And like the end user of the car, also they're going to kind of not really understand the value in this, right? But we could make changes and change different colors, and if we were experimenting, we could kind of move back and forth, similar to what we do in CSS. And then finally, he says the storefront, and I would give this example of the store or the storeroom, right? Or the showroom. And I think in this example, it's really good because we have the cars that are being shown in this beautiful light, right? It's emphasizing the aesthetics of it, what's making the car up. And they're also demonstrating in this example the colors of the different fabric that you could have, right? And it's being shown in a very kind of specific way that's very aestheticized, and it's very driven towards like that end stakeholder. What is that experience supposed to be like? So in the factory and in the showroom, we have a very different experience. And so the argument is that these tools have the spectrum, and they perform a different operation, I guess, on them. And I think the thing is, and these are the tools I'm kind of proposing, Storybook styled components, although you could switch, React Syleguidist. But the process isn't really linear, right? So like I showed that map before, it's kind of a mess. So really maybe these are kind of cycles that you go through where you go in the factory, you start building something out, and then maybe it goes through design, and then you work on the paint booth, but then maybe it goes back and forth a few times, right? Refining the details until it's built. So first thing I'll talk about is Storybook. Has anyone used Storybook with React All right. How's your experience been so far? Good? Bad? What are some of the bad things about it?
I think one of the main downsides of using Storybook for me was that I was kind of forced to use it like a unit test, I guess, to describe the components, which is not what I wanted to, like, what I intended to use it in the first place, because I wanted it to more like a visualization protocol for me in order to see like my components while developing in action, but it was kind of forcing me to write it in a unit test way. I didn't want that, so that's I think one of the downsides of using Storybook for me.
Yeah. So what would be the intent then? So if it was more visualized, sorry, we stole the mic from you. Like if it was more visualized, like how could it work better for you as a tool?
Um, I'm not I'm not sure actually, but I think like the visualization part was working perfectly. I mean, once you get to know the tool and once you get to use how like get used to how to use it, everything's fine. But the entry process was not linear for me because it was not what I was expecting it to do for me. So I wanted to like somehow interpret or process my React components out of the box and try to visualize them like automatically. That's what I wanted from that tool, but I couldn't get it from it.
Yeah. Okay. So that's good. In I may be a bit philosophical by nature, but I want to hear like both the good and the bad. So let's go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically just a bit of background. We used it to show our React UI components as a kind of a component list like what we have available in our platform. And then there were some options to kind of modify how they look. Like for a button, you could change things, and designers and other developers could basically see all the options that were available for a component. So for us, it kind of worked okay. We noticed that when we wanted to get some functionality in, there were lots of plugins and things you could kind of bring in. And some of them worked okay, some of them didn't really work. So it was a bit of a mess at the time we used it. It might have been developed more, so maybe now it's better. But at the time, it was a bit difficult to get it working the way you wanted it to work. So
Yeah.
I had a feeling that they wanted it to be something, and we were maybe using it for the wrong thing. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Thank you. So maybe some people have tried to use it in a project and it didn't work the way you expected, or it was maybe a bit difficult to configure. And I think this is okay. And there's actually a new, I think version 5 coming out in February, which it already is. So I don't know the exact date for the launch, but there is some new stuff coming out. I think a lot of it has to do with branding and kind of moving farther across the spectrum from being kind of like a component builder towards a living style guide, which some people use it that way. So it's certainly something to check out. So these are the things I've kind of found in my own research. And so I'm doing some stuff on my own, and I'll share with you at the end a project where you can kind of check this out in a starter kit and get started quite quickly with TypeScript and all of these tools together. And I'm also in a project, I can't say what, been using Storybook for kind of solving this problem that I'm outlining, right? How do I skip to step 5 or 6 and work in these components in isolation? And the biggest thing I think it does is it decouples these kind of JavaScript stories, and they don't actually have to resemble the actual final code. But if you're creating these stateless components that are taking a bunch of properties and displaying things out with simple interaction, it's quite easy to hook it together with a few plugins and see are actions triggering. You can put knobs in, you can try different types of text and different parameters. And it's kind of like maybe like a laboratory. In college, I was in like a mechanical engineering laboratory, so we had all sorts of motors and different things we could assemble and try out. So I think it's kind of like that, but it's not really like the showroom, right? It's probably if I took my mom in and said, "Oh, we're building robots," she would think I was crazy. The other thing is you're describing the component's use, and I think this gets a little bit towards what you're saying about unit tests. So it does feel kind of unit testy in that respect. They're like all one after another, and it's written very similar way to kind of if you use Jest or another Jest or another test runner. And the other thing I think it's really good for is exposing edge cases, and this is like really quite good because you can create a whole bunch of just, like you were creating those test cases, you can expose all these weird variances that you think that you might have in a project, but it's not in the full working environment. So you can see how they expand or work in the UI and test across different browsers. This is an example from Storybook. It's really simple, right? It's a button. And again, I think it does look and read a lot like a unit test, right? We're importing in Storybook, right? We're using this add-on actions, which is pretty cool. What it does is you click on it and it creates like a pseudo action that shows up in the bottom of the browser. So you can have a whole bunch of actions wired to it that are pseudo actions and see, does it work as expected? There's some other things too, like knobs that I'm not showing. And basically, we have this stories of, which is a lot like describe, right? And it looks a lot like a unit test. But the way it works in actuality is you have a whole bunch of them one after another, just like you'd have unit tests kind of jumbled together. We would test the button, say 8 different ways, say, does it work? What does it look like? And we can flip through them really quickly. And I think it's a very good tool for that. So the second part of my talk, or the second tool, I think CSS in React kind of sucks. And when I say in React, I mean like basic React without adding any sort of extra thing. Does anyone agree? Does anyone think it's great? Okay, one person agrees that it sucks. Who says it's awesome? The built-in without adding any libraries or extra tooling like Sass. Okay, so one person agrees, everyone else is neutral. Okay, so what kinds of limitations are there? Does anyone use inline styles in React? Yep, okay. Can you think of any limitations out of the box for the built-in inline styling for React?
Yeah, reusability. Unless
Reusability.
you're somehow extracting it to some sort of object in JavaScript or like a shared file.
Yeah.
Because in that case, you're even violating the inline style rule. So, yeah. There are other things like cascading, for example, that you have in built-in CSS, but you can't have in inline style easily. I don't know, like inheritance, probably.
Yeah, those are great examples, and I don't have my super notes here, but from memory, I think one of them that's kind of a blocker for me, there's two. One is there's no sort of sense of global style, so if you want some sort of global layout or styling or CSS reset of some sort, right, then you have to then import some CSS, right, or use Webpack to import CSS. And the other thing it doesn't support is hover states on buttons, which I think, like, probably everyone needs a hover state. So for me, that makes it kind of useless. And so I started, I've been working with Sass and CSS for quite some time on bigger projects that are kind of maybe a bit architecture heavy. And I moved to this and I thought, I'm going to go all in. I'm going to start using these inline styles. And I ran into some of these problems and I thought, well, this kind of sucks. But I kind of like the idea of working within JavaScript because React is such a JavaScript focused project as opposed to, say, Angular or Vue. I really wanted a JavaScript way and just to kind of experiment. And so what I found is styled components was a pretty good solution for me. And I could talk a little bit about why I thought it was a good solution. One was I could take CSS just directly in and import it, almost kind of copy and paste into the component, and it just kind of worked. So I like that. It also gave me a familiar kind of CSS style, although kind of embedded within my JSX.
It's a hover style?
And also it was very heavily documented, well used, and it's well supported across a lot of projects. So Create React App and these other projects that we're looking at today, it works really quite well with those. So the other things, and I maybe mentioned this, I'm not sure, global styles is kind of a big thing for me. Like you're going to have some sort of global styles. You can't just avoid it. Normalize, which is the CSS reset that I'm familiar with and like to use. And attributes and themes. I thought these were all really cool features that are built into style components. And this is an example of it. And I'm using this app wrapper as kind of a way to use this styled normalized library to include it. I've got global style, and this is being imported just kind of like a component at the top level. And it's quite easy to use. And we have this header. This is how the global style is working. And in this case, it's not being color coded. But if you use VS Code, it works quite well. There's a plugin for that. And keyframes and animations, kind of a one stickler that doesn't work exactly like CSS, but they do work like these separate components. And this is an example of a header. And so basically what you end up with is a kind of a functional component that contains the styles and then you end up having to kind of wrap that around your other component. So there is this kind of attaching, and I think what you're going to find is that in any of these CSS and JS libraries, there's some sort of binding to it, either in the inline style or as classes that you have to attach to the component. So there's some way you have to kind of bind and attach that. So you're not going to get away from it. So the last tool I'll go through a little bit quickly, and if you have any questions, I know we're kind of discussing, please feel free to ask. But Brad Frost in this article talks about the style guide as the happy home where all the design system stuff lives. And I think this is, like, if we go back to this idea of the showroom, like that's kind of like the happy home of the car, right? Like the cars don't really live that way. Like we can go and walk out on the street in Helsinki. They're like covered with snow and dirty and, you know, who knows what's inside the car. They don't look like they're shown in the showroom. But this is what you kind of want to create. And if you're creating a living style guide for your organization, you want to kind of create this like happy home that your stakeholders and also your designers can kind of get behind and get excited about. So not just about the developer stuff and like, here's my components and they're working. Like you want to make them look nice and look happy, right? Like a fancy car, like not like this car on the street, right? So the React Syleguidist, it's really quite nice because basically what you can do is create markdown files that can live in line with your components. There's many other ways to articulate this. And you end up with Markdown. You can write it however you want, and you can have your JSX examples sitting right there. So very similar to what Storybook is doing, but in Markdown. That's really the only difference. And also maybe less plugins that are focused on building the component, more on documenting and kind of CI kind of stuff. So we're coming to the end of the talk. If you're interested in any of this and you want to try it out, I highly recommend you check out on my GitHub, James Stone CO. There's a couple of them, they're pinned, you can check out. There's this one called Foldable. So if you wanted to try out any of these three with TypeScript, you can download, try it out today. Also, React Finland's coming up. There's a design systems workshop by the creator of React Syleguidist. So I'm gonna go. Is anybody else going to the workshop? Nope, okay. But if you want to go, I estimate 4 to 5 tickets. It's not very clear from the website remaining. And that's it, thank you.
Thank you, James. Any questions, comments?
I have a comment / question.
Yeah.
So I actually think that the fact that Syleguidist uses Markdown as its base makes a huge difference in my experience. Because we used to use Storybook initially, and we also could not figure out exactly what we would be using it for. Whereas now we're not using Syleguidist, but we are using a Markdown first system. And it's so much better because we focus much more on the text about how to use the component or anything to consider, and sort of the demoing comes afterwards almost. Like, have you had any experience with that sort of thing, like sort of focusing on the pros, so to speak, of the documentation versus the component demo itself?
Yeah, I think it's a great point that you bring up, and it's one that Brad Frost is trying to communicate, I think, in his article, that there is this spectrum and that these tools cover kind of different parts of the spectrum. So what you're describing is kind of like making it beautiful or readable or like the happy home. It's quite challenging to do inside of Storybook because it's not really designed for that purpose. And my experience has been working on small design systems that are built for an agency that are handed off to a dev team, right? So I had no interaction on the actual development. I built these UI component kits and kind of sent them over. And what I can say, I used similar kind of tooling, but not in React, to deliver these. And it was all about the developer experience. So if you think about Bootstrap and the documentation, it was kind of a slimmed down version of that, but everything they needed to get started and work with it. And I think if you can build something like that, and for me, I haven't gotten any questions back from those dev teams or bugs or weird things. So I think like that's the reason why you'd want to use Syleguidist to create really nice documentation. And you should empathize with developers if that's your audience. Make it super easy for them to understand and work with. And if your spectrum is larger, pay maybe closer attention to the naming and also additional documentation that can live along with it that kind of describes what it is, the project, and how it works or how it's installed, right? What are we calling these things? And then it kind of becomes a common language for your organization. So Again, these ones I was working on, they're mostly sent to a development team. You have to think about the audience. So it maybe depends on what the intended audience is for that style guide that you're building.